I want you all, by the way, to go to scottsheaauthor.com. And you can also go to strangebrew.co.uk, by the way. Scott is a absolutely groovy writer, is the best way to describe him. We've had terrific conversations with Dave about Wolfman Jack. We've had great conversation about the Mamas and the Papas. His book, I think, in many ways is definitive. An absolute pleasure to have Scott again. He's becoming a regular, reoccurring institution over here. I also think that that book on the Mamas and the Papas, by the way, is maybe the best version of one of my favorite rock and roll stories. The whole kind of incarnation of what it was that the Monterey Pop Festival became and the impact that it had moving forward. The name of that book, by the way, that you can find that in is All the Leaves Are Brown, How the Mamas and the Papas Came Together and Broke Apart. So that pop festival is covered pretty darn well in there. So when I saw that Scott had written a piece about it, I said, well, what's he going to kind of get into here? Remember, that book is about John Phillips' kind of, him and Lou Adler and Derek Taylor and a bunch of other people kind of cooking that thing up. This new article, by the way, disguised as clickbait, it's got the best five, top three, five, six, and all that kind of stuff, is actually a beautiful in-depth analysis of the five biggest winners and the five biggest losers at the Monterey Pop Festival. I've now previewed it without giving you the details of it, and now I get to say good morning to you, Scott. How you been?
Hey, how you doing, Jimmy Mac? Thanks for having me back on, man.
Oh, you got it, brother. And by the way, this is one of my... I have to be very careful here because I love this story. I'm a big, big fan of the moment before something happens. And the events leading up to Monterey Pop are the moment before something happens. And that something is the Summer of Love. And as you look back on it, and you've come to the same conclusion that I did, you just wrote about it, is that it is one of the greatest marketing campaigns ever conceived in music or U.S. history. It is ingenious, and it actually ends up creating a winner that doesn't even appear at the festival. Where did you begin with this idea?
Well, we were just coming up on the anniversary of it, when I started to write it, and was looking for something to write about, and I thought, well, I know a little bit about the Monterey Pop Festival. I wrote about it, like you said, for the book, and just talked about its impetus. It started really with two guys named Ben Shapiro and Alan Parasier. They had organized a rally to get legal funds for teenagers who had been arrested for the Sunset Strip riots in 1966. And they did a concert, had Peter, Paul, and Mary, The Doors, and a couple other, I think Buffalo Springfield had been there. And they wanted to do it on a grand scale. And booked some dates in Monterey in the summer of '67. And they wanted the Beatles and the Stones to headline it, but they were kind of out of the touring business at that point. And Derek Taylor, whom you mentioned, who was the former publicist for the Beatles and the Byrds, was in. He had emigrated to Los Angeles and said, "Hey, you got the Mamas and the Papas right here in town. They're the hottest group. Why don't you go see John Phillips?" And they did. And John kind of took it over, made it a 3-day nonprofit festival, and was able to get a pretty stout lineup of artists, some that I don't even think he envisioned would go on to be as big as they became.
It's interesting too that one of the people who didn't benefit from this is that if John Phillips had realized his skill as an impresario was realized in that moment, he might have had a very different career, but he was still very much in depth with the Mamas and the Papas. They don't benefit from it. That's one of the great ironies, that the man at the center of it, his own band, ends up not getting the best of sort of its best foot forward at the event, do they?
Yeah, it was a group that had always kind of been in turmoil since they signed with Dunhill because of affairs. Denny had, really kind of a one-night stand with Michelle, and Denny and Cass was in love with Denny, but Denny wasn't in love with Cass, and it was just this whole crazy thing, and so they kind of took a break. And that's when the whole festival came to John, and John just went into full-on work mode, and just got so busy focusing on the festival and getting acts for it, and just managing every jot and tittle, and flying up to Monterey to talk to the city council and Mayor Minnie Coyle many times, just to keep everything on track and just kind of forgot about his own band, even though he had arranged for them to be the closers. It's kind of a big thing in the festival to be the festival closer. And, Cass had gone to the East Coast to have her baby, and then he went to the Virgin Islands to kind of get away from it all. And, he was, John's focus was not on the group, and they only rehearsed when Denny showed up very, very late into the third day of the festival to rehearse, to perform, and rehearsrsed about an hour or two before they were set to go on stage, and that was it. They didn't even have time to, they had two big hits on the charts in early to mid '67. They had Dedicated to the One I Love and Creaky Alley, and because they hadn't been together, they hadn't been able to work up an on-stage arrangement. So they as everybody else was, putting on playing new pieces of music and trying to get away from the old hits. Mamas and the Papas set was kind of a greatest hits package amongst a lot of technical difficulties because of Jimi Hendrix just absolutely erupting and blowing up the onstage monitors by smashing his guitar and taking out a microphone. So that didn't help either. So it was just a very imbalanced set for them, unfortunately.
I have two questions that I think really, one is about you and your overall writing projects. The other one is about this piece itself that I think is just so kind of cool to kind of dig into. So you kind of pivot into this, and by the way, you kind of frame the Mamas and the Papas as maybe the biggest loser of the entire festival. Can you take us through a little bit about how it is you conceived of? Because what you've done here is the impossible, because this is a format that is often used as clickbait to infuriate, top 5, top 10, top piss you off. This is not that. You're using a format, and then each paragraph becomes kind of a mini pocket symphony. See what I did there? Of an explanation of why the band or the act kind of plays out. Why did you decide to kind of jump into that format?
Because it's so popular. People, as much as we don't like those clickbait things, I'm guilty of clicking on them too, and checking out and getting into internal agreements or disagreements with them, and I kind of approached it. I want to do the opposite of what everybody else is doing. It's like everybody else is doing these clickbait articles where there's 3 sentences, to try to sum up something. I wanted to delve a little bit deeper and have do a little bit of my writing style. And, I love history. I love telling stories. So I used it as an opportunity to just try to draw people in, because I think reading longer form stuff is better for you. It's better for your brain.
It is.
And it gives you the entire picture. I don't like sound bites, and I mean I do, but I also like to I enjoy a good long form article more than anything, and I just tried to recreate that.
It's interesting because, like I said, I like a good sound bite if it's helping me make a decision about what long form I want to engage in. That's how I feel about a sound bite. That's about the extent of my love of sound bites. And by the way, Scott, I mean that. I'm not just blowing smoke because you're here on the show. I'm obsessed with the Monterey Pop Festival because I'm obsessed with the idea of the liminal space of becoming, the idea that the summer of love really kind of comes to life in this moment, the idea that rock and roll, along with an album, one of the biggest winners out of this festival, who was nowhere near to be seen despite rumors of them lurking around, but the idea of becoming and being someplace at the outset, which is of a double obsession. I've always kind of liked that stuff, but also we're over here in the city of New Orleans getting our own new platform going with some really loyal listeners and some really loyal followers who are kind of with us. And I was kind of curious, in your research, at any point, and you made a point of saying that Lou Adler is one of the big winners here, I don't think Phillips, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is aware of what exactly it is he is bringing to life. He thinks this is all going to crescendo with the Mamas and the Papas walking out as big stars. But Adler, on the other hand, and to a large degree Taylor, who had some very definitive ideas, really understand that the event itself is kind of a watershed. Do you think that any of these people were fully aware of what it was they were creating while they were creating it?
I don't think it's possible to really be aware of it. I think they were, they had a goal in mind of putting on a really great show, and it being completely legitimate, not not like a Dick Clark's Caravan of Stars, which I have nothing against the Dick Clark Caravan of Stars. I see those lineups from the early to mid '60s. I would have loved to go to those shows, but that was kind of a negative connotation for them. They didn't want to have just a couple artists come out, sing one or two songs, and then be on their way, and the thing's over in a half hour or an hour. They wanted to, like we said, they wanted it to be long form. And John had wanted to do this. John Phillips had wanted to do this with folk music. He was always trying to spread the word about. He would, he kind of became a folk aficionado, for a guy who really didn't even know folk music growing up. He went into it full force when he was with the Journeymen, and wanted to spread the good news of folk music, with festivals and TV shows and movies and things like that. And then when he got involved in the rock and roll scene, at first begrudgingly, because he was not a fan. He was kind of a folk snob. He looked down on rock and roll. But then he kind of saw the light and saw how sophisticated it was getting, and how he could be a champion of that. And that's how the Monterey Pop Festival came along. He kind of, really this kind of germinated in his mind when he and the band took a short trip over to England in '66, and they got to meet the Stones and the Beatles and just exchange ideas and play records and things like that. And it was just something that, his mind just craved and enjoyed. And he wanted to bring that to the people. And I think he played it cool when these two guys approached him about this. But I think, he was, the way he jumped on so quickly just showed that this was something I think he had been waiting for.
And like I said, I want to go back to the idea of not just the event itself, but what surrounds the event. You named the Beatles as one of the big winners. Of course, Sgt. Pepper's, as people have often said, you walk across a college campus, and as you walk by the open windows, you could hear different songs from that album playing out of every single window. And at the same time, you got Scott McKenzie singing a song that's written by a couple of these characters called San Francisco. You make San Francisco one of the big winners here, one of the great unintentional record preview commercials for the Monterey Pop Festival ever created. And it's like this convergence of both planning and happy accidents that leads to what is kind of known as the Summer of Love. And so much of it is replication too. This is what I wanted to ask you about. Sorry, I'm getting to my question. Is the fact that this is a result of, okay, so how do we replicate the idea of creating a song that creates a kind of national, just like Chubby Checker's The Twist? San Francisco has the same sort of impact that those kind of albums had, just for a different culture. Then you have this festival that's modeled off the folk festival, which had shown great success. Then you have someone using a festival to then make sure that their band, which is not present at the festival, becomes massive beneficiaries of that. And I'm wondering if the beginning of modern music promotion really begins with the Monterey Pop Festival in regards to rock and roll.
Yeah, I think so, because there's so many important people who were in attendance. I mean, Clive Davis was there. Jan Wenner was one of the reporters who had, was there from the beginning. The guy went on to, create Rolling Stone. And one of his first pieces in his first edition of Rolling Stone was like an investigatory piece on the Monterey Pop Festival and where did the money go? They just kind of try to expose corruption and all that, which that just didn't take. That didn't come out the way he wanted. But there were so many people. I think that the Summer of Love would have happened with or without the Monterey Pop Festival, but this just amplified it, and I think it just brought a lot of like-minded people together. I think rock and roll was headed this way as it matured, as the audience, as the people who provided it, got a little bit older. It's one of the few times in history where pop music aged with its audience, and its audience was young. You got to keep in mind all these performers were just kids and record buying kids when Bill Haley and Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley really kind of kickstarted the thing in the mid '50s, and they grew with it, and they turned away for a little while with the folk boom, but they came back with the Beatles, and this was just a logical progression. And if it didn't happen here, it probably would have happened somewhere, but this is the ground zero for that, and it just came off so well, and I guess they realized it just couldn't be duplicated, and there were just too many people looking for too much money to keep the Monterey Pop Festival going. But we saw it continue with Woodstock, and into the early '70s with which kind of became like a rock festival season every summer.
Yeah, and this is important too. They filmed it. This is one of the most important things about it, too, in regards to its overall impact on history. Not in the moment, but they filmed it. And in filming it, somebody missed out on the action the first time around because of some very bad, greedy management and got a second bite at the apple. But it actually sets up one of your biggest winners and one of your biggest losers, because the band that got a second bite at the apple basically was a loser, while the lady who stood in front of the microphone for that band ended up being one of the biggest winners. Unpack that for our listeners.
Well, that would be Big Brother and the Holding Company and their singer Janis Joplin. Yeah, they, it was just they were managed by a guy who was kind of a denizen of the of San Francisco of the 1950s when the beatniks came through. His name was Jules Carpin. And, San Francisco just really modeled itself on being uncommercial. In fact, you mentioned how it was filmed, for distribution. They were initially against that, and that was a big point of contention between, the Grateful Dead and the Jefferson Airplane and a few others, because, being from San Francisco, we were all about being non-commercial and making music for no money, which was just not sustainable. So Jules Carpin really put this into action when it became Big Brother's turn to perform. They were the first San Francisco group. They played on day 2, and he ordered the D.A. Pennebaker, who was the documentarian, the producer for the film rights, to point his cameras down, and he did. And Janis and Big Brother just proceeded to bring the house down. So they realized
it's a crime scene. I mean, from what we know happened that day on that stage. The second one is pretty darn good too. But the description of literally, there were very famous people who actually missed it, who actually end up showing up the next day when they're told they're coming back, and there is no other way to. Because what happens on the film is literally they murder the audience. I mean, they just bring the house down. Sorry.
Yeah.
I want to encourage people to watch that. So.
Yeah, it was extraordinary. I mean, you see Mama Cash is absolutely, who is a pretty good singer in her own right, just bowled over by Janis Joplin. And, I think the decision, I think Janis was kind of at loggerheads with Jules Carpin and some of her bandmates. And I think this decision, two things. It ultimately made her realize just how she didn't really need the Big Brother and the Holding Company, who've always kind of been bashed as not being a tight unit on stage or in the studio, which, I don't think that really matters too much when you're singing that kind of music. But I think she, that was the kind of the turning point for her, where she realized
they made her feel small. They knew she was big, so they made her feel small. I mean, maybe I got that wrong, but part of my understanding was it's the old thing when we got a massive talent inside of a band. One of the strategies more resentful band members will do is make the person who actually is the real attraction feel as small as possible, thinking that'll keep them in their place. And at some point, they wake up, and sometimes it happens with Mama Cass in the audience, right?
Yeah, and Albert Grossman, who was Dylan's manager, who was just floored by her and wanted, and took her on as a client, and he made up for any bashfulness she may have had in terms of confronting people like that. So and so a year later, she's on her way, and she becomes a household name, and then of course unfortunately. 3 years after the festival, she's gone forever. She and Jimi Hendrix, who was also another big winner,
and Otis Redding, who brought the house down too. He's gone too.
Yeah, and I think that's also another thing that makes the Monterey Pop Festival so special is you have these 3 icons who are just gone in the blink of an eye. We have them all here preserved on film in this spectacular setting.
Yeah, and I really would encourage people to watch that movie really in depth because it's skillfully made. He's an incredibly great documentary filmmaker. People forget he's also the man who made the John F. Kennedy documentary Primary, which is one of the best looks at like a behind the scenes of a campaign
Right.
that is desperately trying to dredge up votes in Protestant country for a Catholic Bostonian candidate. This is equally behind the scenes. It's also a great reminder too that every single flower power concert doesn't always mean that people are whiling around in the mud, dressed down to their knickers. It really is. There's a lot of fancy pantsness that goes on at that concert as well too. It was kind of a coming out party for rock and roll as well. It almost feels like a ball of sorts, like an alternative ball in the way people
Yeah,
kind
I
of
mean, you
dress.
see people in the audience in ties, and people kind of dress like older women dress like my grandmother, So it's quite interesting, and I believe D.A. Pennybaker also directed the Dylan documentary "Don't Look Back," which came out in '66
Yes,
or
he did.
'67.
Yes,
So.
he did. Yeah, I mean, basically, without him, we don't have any sort of access to a lot of the reality of what happened back there. As you guys have probably noticed, I'm not giving away all the names on this list because I want you to read the piece. But the one question I wanted to ask you, and I'm curious as if it was because of his association with the Beatles. One person you didn't list, unless maybe I just completely missed it, is Ravi Shankar, who I always have felt kind of is one of the people who really kind of has an amazing coming out party in regards to his exposure to the world. But do you think it's also kind of Harrison's connection to him that he becomes kind of I
Well,
guess, a subsidiary beneficiary of all this?
yeah, you're right. He definitely was, and he had his own time slot, like right there Sunday morning, I think. And they took he played.
The only one
Those
paid.
yeah, right. The only one paid, and he played those ragas for hours, and it was a very captive audience. And when it's all done, you can see a clip of Mickey Dolenz just standing up and giving a rousing applause. And it was, yeah, I think it wasn't not just the connection with George Harrison, but the Moody Blues were
Oh yeah.
just getting hot, and they were all into the Eastern sounds of the tabla and the sitar and everything, and it was coming into foray. I mean, you even heard it you even heard it in pop songs like The Letter by the Box Tops and stuff like that. Just kind of played straight, it's not played the way it would probably. Ravi Shankar probably quivered when he heard the way they played it in that, but it became prominent. You hear it in Stevie Wonder songs and things like that, and in the late '60s, and it's everywhere. And it really started with Ravi Shankar, and George Harrison was the one who brought him to the forefront of the pop scene, anyway.
Yeah, and of course the thing is the Beach Boys, who had a beautiful celebration, by the way, on CBS just recently. The Beach Boys, of course, are somebody who actually the big wave break actually misses them. Something that Brian Wilson was so attuned to, he finds himself unable to be there. Right?
Yeah, they had been on since the beginning, since the planning stages. And keep in mind, this was like a 6-week planning. They did this thing in such a fast turnaround. It's mind-boggling. But I think April they started doing it, and it debuted on June 16th or June 17th. So Brian Wilson was on their board of governors, and they were slated to be the openers of day 2, and it just didn't work out. Mike Love and he were kind of they were kind of feuding at that point over the direction of the band. With the Smile album that was supposed to follow up Pet Sounds, but ultimately got shelved. And Mike still wanted to tour in the striped suits and the white pants, and Brian's like, he saw the writing on the wall, and that just wasn't going to pass. So Brian ultimately bowed out of them performing, and it doesn't seem like there was much pushback from the other guys. I think they were kind of relieved to not have to be there because it wasn't their crowd, it wasn't their audience. But who knows? Had they gone there? But they were kind of tied. They're kind of like Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. They were kind of a group that was around just a little bit before the Beatles came, and then when the Beatles came, they elevated their game. and just kept up, but ultimately just couldn't match it with Sergeant Pepper, and
Well, and
just kind of fell by the wayside.
that's a whole other conversation, because while there's some very gifted people who were in the Beach Boys, basically it was Brian Wilson versus three guys and a really good adaptive drummer. That's just not a fair fight to some degree, and that's a conversation worth having at another point in time. Scott, unbelievably, we're out of time. I'm going to have Claire reach out to you and see if we can get you back sooner rather than later, because I do want to talk about Sly Stone. I do want to have a more in-depth conversation about Brian Wilson. You're the best, man, and I can't recommend that book, by the way, that we have also talked about here really quickly, guys, to kind of touch on it again. All the Leaves Are Brown, how the Mamas and the Papas came together and broke apart. I don't think I've ever read a section of a book recently as quickly as I read that Monterey Pop section. The rest of the book is pretty darn terrific, too. Please check it out, as well as this article. By the way, guys, you can find it on thestrangebrew.co.uk. Just look up the Monterey Pop Festival. It'll pop up there. Thank you, Scott. It's great to have you on again, man.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Scott Shea is a regular recurring dude over here talking about rock and roll, the history of rock and roll, the reconstruction. He, by the way, is a performance reconstructionist, which is a kind of really complicated thing that we won't have time to talk about in the next half hour, but it's a really groovy way of writing history.